everybody. Let's just keep the inclusion theme going. Do me a favor, turn to somebody on your left and say aloha. And someone on your right, how about a bonjour? And someone behind or in front of you, how about a little namaste? So my grandfather evidently was a bum. Sorry, Nanu, life choices. He spent all the money he made building beautiful pieces of furniture, bookcases, staircases, desks, on women, the fights, and booze. Did not do a lot of the parenting of the 7 children he sired. That was left up to my grandmother, Maria Angelina, for whom I am named. She made a living sewing gloves piecemeal for pennies, fed the 7 children, clothed them, got them to school. And the first 5 children lived in a 1-bedroom, rent-controlled apartment, low-income housing, which was only supposed to have 2 people in it, but the landlord let her stay there with all of those children because she fed him nicely and kept the place spotless. Until one day, my grandmother unlocked a secret door, a drawer rather, in her bureau, a drawer my grandfather didn't know about, and gathered together $320 of dimes and quarters and nickels and bought the family a 2-story, 4-bedroom house that they lived in. And she lived in until she died at the age of 92. She is a model for me of determination, of resilience, of visioning a possible better future. But there are larger influences to consider here in this moment. Influences that move beyond the effect on one girl, one granddaughter. Scott Barry Kaufman and his colleagues have identified the Light Triad of personality, human beings who really exemplify who we might be at our best, who are, in Barry Kaufman's words, everyday saints. They believe in the fundamental goodness of human beings. They understand that we ought to treat each other as significant unto ourselves, not as a means to our ends. And they have a potent and consistent consideration and intention of the dignity and worth of human beings, even those who do not look and seem as we do. Think, if you will, of the Dalai Lama praying for those who invaded his country, or Valerie Kaur reaching through prison guards to forgive the murderer of her uncle. Balbir was killed in the weeks following 9/11 simply because he wore a turban and looked like the enemy. Think of any time you have chosen kindness over vengeance, love over anger or hate. I'd like to invite us, by considering what Barry Kaufman is pointing to, into a larger understanding of why we are here. We are here, everything that we are here to absorb over the weekend is for us. It's for our individual health, well-being, resilience, happiness, our thriving in life. And yet it is never just about us. We might have a positive contagion effect, just like those light triadic people, because here's the thing. Those of us who live closer and closer to the light triad actually change how other human beings live in the world. This is the contagion effect we can control, to steal a phrase from Sigal Barsaid, who in the middle of the pandemic did some research and invited us to consider, making sure that we create a kind of barrier around us, around the negative emotional contagion that might be happening in your offices or communities, avoiding or diminishing at least the impact of pessimism, fear, even hate. And in her research, she came to remind us that we ought to be thinking and attuning ourselves toward a positive contagion effect and centering ourselves in what we might bring and how we might care for ourselves positively by both surrounding ourselves with those who live in the positive emotional states that we know are so important. This is a thread line back to earlier research from Christakis and Fowler in 2008, who discovered that if you kind of hang out in a neighborhood with happier people, you are 25% more likely to be happier. And from that research, they posited that happiness, like health, might actually be a collective phenomenon. You see, it is no longer enough to just think of our individual health and well-being. At the last IPA conference, Antonella Della Fave from the University of Milan said this: "It is not enough to think any longer of an individual resilience. We must, for the sake of this world, consider data, research, application, anecdote, and living as if we are together in a collective resilience." So this positive contagion effect, what I'm hoping will happen is that as you sit here and absorb all the wonderful richness that you are here to absorb, that you remember that this is not just for you. And that it is, this living is necessary, this planet, our very living as a species is necessary for us to carry with us. This notion that we have an influence on who we live with now, who is yet to come, and all of those around this planet. So here's a question. Who do you seek to make happier? I mean, forget that one relative who drives you crazy who will never be happy. But other than him or her or them, who do you seek to make happier? Who do you seek to influence? Whom is all this for? Who is all this for? I'm beginning a writing project on appreciation of beauty, physical beauty, but also moral beauty, moral excellence. And I've been working just, in the initial stages over the last 8 months. And I've taken to imagining a young child far in a land far away, in a time far from now, in that moment, maybe she's 8, maybe she's 9, noticing the sort of arc of the tree as it bends in the wind and being stunned, having her first conscious experience and awareness of awe, and returning to her family, and they know exactly how to support her in her appreciation of awe, exactly know how to support her in appreciation of beauty because of what we are doing today. Because our lineages are not just our families, they're our friends are in circles and circles and circles beyond. Who knows what impact our moment just a few moments ago might be having one day soon in the East and in the far West. Who is all this for? Please bring one person to mind. And I encourage you to stretch yourself beyond the usual suspects. Who, living now or living in the future, do you want to change their life? This is not new news. Brazilian theologian Ruben Alves wrote this: "In the last century, we must live by the love of what we will never see. We must live by the love of what we will never see." We are date planting right now, right here. And from the 14th century, lyric poet Hafez admits something. Everyone you see, you say to them, "Love me." Of course, you don't say this out loud because somebody would call the cops. Still though, think about this great pull in us to connect. Why not become who lives with the full moon in each eye? Why not become the one who lives with kindness and love and appreciation and noticing, that intentional noticing our last speaker was talking about? Why not become the one who lives with that sweet moon language, offering, always saying what every other eye in this world is dying to hear? And from our time, we lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that even as we grieved, we grew, even as we hurt, we hoped, and even as we tired, We tried. So first, we widen the lens of attention. Who is all this for? Second, we double down on our practices. How many of you are practicing gratitude at this time? Right. Doubling down. We know that when you practice gratitude, what happens? Increasing optimism, increasing social bonding, softening of the effects of trauma, reduced time spent in negative emotional states. So many positive benefits accrue for the individual, but also notice what happens as we practice gratitude. What strengthens are the systems around us, the family and the work systems. It literally improves work-related stress for others when we consistently show up practicing gratitude. The positive connection effect. Here's that gorgeous work of Barbara Fredrickson. We know that micro moments of positivity, like turning to someone and saying aloha, right? We are starting to trigger those micro moments of positivity resonance that benefit us, right? We feel lifted, we feel warm, oxytocin increases, the tone and function of the vagus nerve, which goes from the primary brainstem to the heart, improves. And while we're doing that, while we're feeling that, there is a resonance happening with the person across from us, and they are having a mirrored response, benefiting their health and well-being also. And this notion of the ideal self, Richard Boyatt says, the Via Character people, the notion of asking and holding the question, who might I be at my best in this moment? Who might I be at my best as I attempt to move toward that sort of light triadic state of love, compassion, humanity, dignity, worth of all, landing us in the highest of our virtues, wisdom, temperance, transcendence, justice, courage. Witnessing moral excellence, like when we witness someone like the Dalai Lama, when we witness someone standing up to evil, witnessing this triggers an action tendency within ourselves. We try to protect what we love, but we try to emulate what we find beautiful to the heart and to the soul. So we stretch into becoming better people. And as we become better people ourselves, as we actually live into who we might be at our best, we create that action tendency in others. In the spring of last year, early spring, just around this time actually, my guy and I were out in our backyard clearing away the garden beds, getting them ready for the early spring planting. And we bent down to the lettuce bed and saw this tiny little nest of bunnies, like little 2-week-old baby bunnies. And we thought, oh shit, because mama has found her way to the lettuce patch. And if those bunnies grow up there, like bunnies, like there's going to be 40 of them in a minute, right? And they all know a way in now because mama has found her way in. And for 1 second, we thought, we can't have bunnies in the lettuce patch. But there was no way I could touch those bunnies, because just before going out into the garden, we had our morning tea together. Well, he had coffee, I had tea. And I had just read a story about a gentleman named Erich Schwamm who had died in his later years, an Austrian gentleman who had died and had given $2.4 million to a small village in France. And the sort of powers that be in that small village were like, yay, and who is this guy? And it turns out in 1943, Erich and his parents were sheltered by those villagers from 43 through 44 through 45, keeping them alive. He grew up, did well, and decided to leave everything he had to the descendants of the people who had saved his family's life. You can't touch a bunny's head when you have a story like that in mind. We are better human beings when we live into this question, who might I be at my best? So as you think about who or what you're grateful for, or how you might trigger positive connections, or how you might live into this ideal self question, I ask you to hold in mind, who is all this for? We can no longer afford to think of individual health, well-being, happiness, and resilience. What happens to one happens to all. Just before the pandemic, Omid Safi, who is the professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke University, was invited to speak at a conference in California, and he took his family out to California to do a little sightseeing first, and they went to see the redwood forest. Does anybody know the redwood forest? And he saw a phenomenon there that made no sense to him at all. What he saw was, in a number of places, not just one, was a deadened, blackened trunk almost to the ground, surrounded by an area of total devastation, a huge circle of devastation, and around the outer circle of that devastation, a young growth of redwood trees. And it made no sense to him at all. What is happening here? And eventually he came to another one of those examples, and there was a plaque written by the stewards of the forest, and the plaque said the following: "What you are seeing is the deadened snag of a giant ancient redwood tree who lived here hundreds of years ago. But something happened, natural disaster or fire or disease, and the tree died. And yet it did not die, because underneath the ground, its root systems continued to provide nutrients and nourishment for the burl sprouts it had sprouted. And the circle of young trees you see now are the heirs to that nourishment. And that even as the tree was dying, it was influencing life beyond itself." When I see my grandmother in my mind's eye, she's bent over. She's bent over that sewing machine, sewing those gloves. She's bent over the stove, cooking us dinner, always 50 grandchildren. I can't even tell you how many great grandchildren there are in my family. She's bent over the broom, cleaning up our messes. She would never, ever have been able. She came to America when she was 17, never learned the language. I wore this dress for her because she would have approved. And she would never have been able to imagine her granddaughter standing in a place like this, in a moment like this, yet she is the standing tree in the circle of my life. And it's okay that she couldn't have imagined this kind of moment, because we can. We can imagine what might be possible as we double down on our practices, as we widen the lens of influence and consider that every choice we make to show up as better human beings, more humane, more kind, a little bit more positive, a little bit more thoughtful, and certainly more self-compassionate, as we give ourselves all the permissions to be human and magnificent at the exact same time, our circles of influence keep widening and widening and widening, even as we live and even as we die. What happens to one happens to all. Thank you so much.